Hi, this is Zack Ellis, the founder and CEO of TheirStory. And in this video, I'll share with you some interviewing tips. So the way that I generally look at interviewing, or at least one way to look at interviewing, is the questions that you ask and then everything else, kind of how you create the right environment for safe environment and for people to be more likely to share vulnerable stories, or at least will be more willing and interested to share their perspective. So just in terms of the questions themselves, one of the main things that I think about is the idea of seek first to understand. If you're thinking about an interview that you are recording, the main purpose of the interview is that it is useful if it's being recorded for people in the future, whether that is for yourself or whether it is for other people on your team or researchers or educators, students, the general public, whomever it may be that might want to access this later. If it's being recorded, it's so that it's useful at a later time. And as my old improv coach would tell me, if you are unsure of what your partner is doing on stage, if you think or if you're not on the same page, or you feel you're not on the same page, then likely they are also feeling the same thing, and the audience likely is confused. And so you can think about this in the same way. If you're not sure what someone said, you can likely be sure that either one, they're not sure of what they said, or two, people who are watching this at a later date won't be sure what was said or what was meant by what was said. So you're doing yourself and everyone else a favor by asking for clarity. Don't be afraid to say, I don't know what that means, or what did you mean by that, or what is that? Could you say it again? Just make sure that you understand what someone else is saying. It's going to allow you to ask better follow-up questions, and it'll demonstrate that you're actually listening to the other person and that you care about what they have to say. Another thing, oftentimes, that is helpful is to go back to the beginning. If someone starts to tell you something that sounds like a meaningful story or an aspect of their career, you might ask something like, how did you get involved? What prompted you to get started? Things along those lines. One way that I like to think about conversations in general, or any story, is that there's kind of three conversations that are happening at any given time. There's the facts, the who, what, where, when, the senses, what something look like, feel like, smell like, sound like. There's a level beyond that, the emotions. What was someone thinking? What were they feeling? And then identity. How do they really see themselves as it relates to the story that they're saying? What impact does it have on who they think they are? And what are their motivations, values? What's the meaning that they make of that story? And when we're interviewing someone, it's less about the truth, it's less about the facts, and it is more so about their memory of a given situation and what is the significance of how they interpret that moment. Because every story is filtered through the lens of that person's experience, their bias, their perceptions. Oftentimes it's really important and really easy, again, to get beyond the facts by just simply asking why. Even if it's just about the who, what, where, when kind of things, why was that person involved? Why was it at that time? Why? Just get to understanding at a deeper level than just the facts, and that can paint a much stronger picture. It can also help to make a story much more relatable when we really uncover the deeper meaning and the feelings behind a given situation. If you're stuck, you can always push a story along by just asking, well, what happened next? And open-ended questions are always something to strive for, as opposed to closed-ended. A closed-ended question is something that is more so a yes or no. For example, if you were to say, did you feel sad? That would be a closed-ended question. An open-ended question might be more like, how did you feel? And the idea is to really give as much power and control to the narrator as possible, and not to project our own emotions or our own assumptions onto them, but to let them kind of have a clean slate, if you will, to just share their experience as it is to them. Asking questions that synthesize, and I like to think about doing this in a way that is kind of tentative. You are in this moment kind of putting a conjecture out there, but this is an opportunity to help a narrator perhaps synthesize new knowledge or look at their own life or their own story in a new lens. And you might say something along the lines of, what, if any, impact did X, Y, or Z that happened earlier in the story have on this current moment, for example? Or you're just trying to relate two different ideas that have been brought up. And this can be a powerful way, again, to demonstrate that you're listening, but also to help the narrator potentially synthesize new knowledge for themselves, which is going to make the interview memorable and valuable to them, beyond just being able to share their story. So those are some of the things around asking questions. But then there's everything else that comes to really creating trust between you and the narrator, which ultimately is going to lead to the most effective interview and the most effective relationship that you are building with someone. And of course, trust takes time. So other things are creating an atmosphere of safety. So what are some ways that you can do this outside of the questions that you ask themselves and how you ask those? One is that I'll point out is just a really simple thing, especially in kind of today's day and age around COVID, but this is always true, is that if you get to the time of the interview and you start, just with some casual conversation, you ask how they're doing, and they tell you that they are exhausted or that something is going on in their family life or anything along those lines that is stressful, simply ask them if they would rather take the time for some time for themselves and to reschedule for another time. They will remember that. They will respect you for that, for caring about them. And ultimately, you're going to get the best interview when that person can be present and when you can be present. And so be mindful of that. That's one way to create an atmosphere of safety. Others can be meeting someone in their own home, meeting at a neutral location. Just ask your narrator what's the environment that would make them most comfortable. That is one of the benefits of remote interviewing. Oftentimes, is that a narrator has the power to choose where they are going to be, generally speaking, and likely it's going to be in the comfort of their own home. Get rid of distractions. This is true always, but especially for remote interviews as well. Turn off your notifications, turn over your phone, or don't even have it out. Put it on silent. All of these sorts of things, but especially in the remote context, turning off your notifications so you're not seeing emails pop up. Anything along those lines that might just pull your attention away. The more present you can be, the more focus you're putting on your narrator and them on you, the better you can stay in the moment and really be paying close attention. Don't be afraid of silence. Silence is key. Sometimes if someone is saying something, you can just not say anything back and let them keep going. When you ask a question, ask it once. Let them say to you if they don't understand it, that's okay, and then you can rephrase it. But ask once, and I really do believe that one of the worst times you can interrupt someone is when they're thinking. And likely, especially if you're interviewing someone who has maybe told certain stories many times over, You know that you might have asked a really good question when they actually have to pause and not just regurgitate a story they've told 1,000 times. So let people be thoughtful in their answers, and just ask and then be silent until they ask either for clarification or then come up with something new that they hadn't thought of before. So again, be aware of nonverbal cues, both theirs and your own. How are you reacting to their stories? Are you passing judgment in the way that you are scrunching your face or whatever it may be? If someone feels judged, then they're not going to feel psychologically safe. They're not going to have that atmosphere of safety. So stay relatively neutral. If not, excited potentially, or just showing affirmations that you're listening, that you're hearing them. But of course, if someone is uncomfortable, then perhaps that's a good indicator to move on to the next question, for example. With that said, though, follow your own curiosity. It's okay to ask a tough question, to ask perhaps a risky question, and let the person do your homework. Make sure that you're well versed in understanding what's culturally appropriate. Do your work, do your homework, but be curious. And if you lead with curiosity, that goes a long way, and that comes to kind of again creating that atmosphere of safety, or of how you ask questions. And you can even use the words, I'm curious, and then say that, and just be honest. Or you can even say, I'm not sure how to ask this, but I'm curious. Along those lines, just be authentic, be yourself, and certainly have a logical progression of questions. And so that is doing your homework ahead of time, whether it's coming up with 15, 20 questions. You might not ask them all. And in fact, usually the narrator is going to answer a number of questions that you've written down, but you haven't asked. But they're really there to be a guide, a way that if someone has responded and you don't have any follow-up questions, that you can go back to kind of the next question, just to keep things going. But be flexible. And when you come prepared with questions, the goal is not usually to get through every single one. The best interviews come really from the follow-up questions and following your narrator to a certain extent, and then using gentle guidance to bring them back to ultimately the goals of the interview and the outcome that's important to each of you. And that's another important key, is that any question that you ask or information that you're looking for, stories that you're looking for, that they serve the purpose of the interview, and being clear about the purpose up front. And if there's that feeling of necessity, or that the story adds value either to the narrator or to yourself for the purpose of the interview, then they're much more likely to be giving in that context. Some bonus tips here about not just the success of a single interview, but really getting better over time and learning as you go. A couple of things. One that I'll say that isn't even on this list is asking at the end of an interview who else might be interesting for you to speak with. One of the best ways to get more interviews around a certain topic is to ask the narrator to help open up their network to you. And if you've done a good job, if you've built trust, and if the narrator has enjoyed the process of sharing their story, and you're helping them to share their story, then they may likely at that point introduce you to someone else. So that is one way to keep things going, and that's a key skill, certainly. So, but how do you improve from interview to interview? Take the time to reflect. It seems obvious, but it's really important, and it can be skipped over. What did you learn from the interview? Actually, try to write their story. Write the story that makes sense to you, and what was important. And as you write the story, what you're going to notice is that you're going to be unsure of certain things. And so when you become unsure of something as you write the story, then you can just write down the question that would help you get clarity on that part of the story that you're unsure of. And so keep that list, one, of the takeaways, and two, of the follow-up questions, either as things you're unsure of or just things that you now want to know or you wish you would have asked. Write those down. Those will be helpful not just for if you go back to interviewing that person, but perhaps those are questions that you realize, oh, it would have been nice to know, or based on new information that I've gotten from this story, I now know of another thing that I could ask about to someone else that will make the next interview that much better. Another tip that I really have found helpful for myself in asking thoughtful questions is pay attention to when someone reframes your question. When you ask, what was your favorite food, I don't know, and someone says, well, something that I really enjoy to cook is, maybe then you could, instead of asking what's your favorite food, say, what do you enjoy to cook? Something along those lines. One that an example of this that I've actually used personally or noticed personally was I used to be on a team of math educators or at a software company, and after observing one of the former math educators give a presentation, I asked him if what he learned from the presentation, and he said, well, at this point I've done it hundreds of times. I don't know if I learn new things, but sometimes people say something that surprised me. And so the next person that gave a presentation, I asked them, did anything surprise you about the audience's reactions or questions? And I said, oh, interesting. So just pay attention again to how people reframe your question, and that can help you think of new questions that might be more insightful given that kind of domain of knowledge that you're interviewing about. The last bit that I'll share here is around a framework for coming up with questions that naturally help to elicit stories, and naturally help to elicit stories that are about a full kind of journey or arc, if you will. So when I was working at a company called Apogee back in San Francisco, they in true Silicon Valley fashion, as I like to joke, like to think of themselves as not just a tech company, but as a philosophy company. And one of their head philosophers, if you will, had recommended that I read the book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces by Joseph Campbell. And Joseph Campbell was a professor of literature at Sarah Lawrence College in New York. And he studied comparative myth and religion, and really the stories that get passed on from generation to generation across cultures, across geographies. And, why were these stories getting passed on? What was common among them? And what he found was that each of these stories, they followed the same underlying structure that he then called the monomyth. It was the same structure that the protagonist, the hero of all these stories, would go through. And the monomyth has been kind of popularized as the hero's journey. And it's the same framework that underlies all the major Hollywood movies that you know, all the novels. George Lucas credits the hero's journey with being the underlying structure of Star Wars. And really, it's the same underlying structure of all of our own lives. We're all the heroes of our own story. And we all are going on this grand journey that is our life, and we have sub-journeys, sub-heroes journeys along the way, all of which follow this general framework, or at least components of it. And so as I was learning the hero's journey and kind of knew what those stages were, I just asked myself, well, what would happen if I were to ask questions that naturally aligned to these stages, and could that potentially help someone else to more easily tell their own story? And sure enough, it worked incredibly well. I would use it to interview customers who were making change in their own organizations, and to tell the stories through the lens of them as the heroes of change in their own organizations. And from there, would use it to interview Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, friends, and anyone I could have a conversation with. And it works well. And by asking these questions that naturally help to progress someone's story and are natural components of a hero's story, you kind of cut out the fat, if you will, of unnecessary questions, and this really gets to the heart of each person's journey. And by asking better questions, you build trust. And this is a great way to come up with questions quickly, or to notice when someone leaves something out of their story. So the basic idea, or some basic questions that align, are things like, in the ordinary world, or the call to adventure, how'd you get started? The refusal of the call. What fears or reservations did you have? Meeting with the mentor, supernatural aid. There's always someone who's helping. Who's influential people you met in the early days? Who got you into playing football, or whatever your career? Who were people that helped you along the way? Crossing the threshold. What was one of your earliest memories? Kind of the first foray into whatever you were doing. Test allies, enemies. Approach the inmost cave, the ordeal. Kind of, this is the road of trials. So what were challenges along the way? How did you overcome them? Who else was important? Who was impacted by these events? What was the significance of those? And then the reward after you go through the ordeal, you slay the dragon, whatever the biggest challenge was that someone had to overcome, you learn something from it, and you grow from it. What have been your proudest moments? What did you learn? Now that you've learned that, as the hero, you are kind of the master of two worlds. You have the opportunity to go back to the regular kind of existence, but with something new, with a new skill that's acquired, with a new power. And how do you use it? Do you teach others? Do you use it for bad? Do you use it for good? How have you been involved since? What does this mean to you now? What advice would you give to other people? How does it impact your life? What role has it had in your life? So these are all things that have been really helpful to show one kind of concrete way that I actually use that hero's journey framework. I have a webinar coming up a week from today with the Oregon Jewish Museum about their use of their story to elicit over 200 oral histories in the past 5 months from their community. And so the first thing I did, and it just took me about 5 to 10 minutes to do, was I just jotted down again that framework. It follows the 3-act structure: departure, initiation, return, as one example of the 3 acts. And then again, those intermittent stages here. And so the ordinary world: tell us about yourself, tell us about Oregon Jewish Museum, Center for Holocaust Education. Why is oral history important to you? What has oral history program meant to the organization? How do people hear about your stories? What have been challenges up to this point? And what does their world look like? The call to adventure. Well, what prompted you to record during the pandemic? Refusal of the call. What fears or reservations do you have about coming into the project, about doing remote interviews? What were your expectations? What were your goals? What did you hope to get out of it? Meeting with the mentor. Well, in this case, their story was the mentor, or at least one of. So what were your first reactions to their story? What did that first look like when coming in contact with us? And crossing the first threshold, what were the first steps that you had to go through to start to prepare to do remote interviews? Initiation. Now we're really into it. They're starting to organize themselves. What was the experience like going through this with the other cohort? Talk about what it was like to onboard volunteers. They had over 30 volunteers who were conducting these interviews. How did you get interviewees? Who else was involved in terms of the staff? And how did the results compare to your expectations? In Most Cave, what have been challenges? Your ordeal. What was the toughest thing you had to deal with? How'd you overcome it? What have you learned about remote interviewing? This is all under the reward. How is it similar, different to in-person interviews? What advantages, disadvantages have you found about doing remote interviews compared to in-person? And then the return. What would you do different if you were starting from scratch? How does this impact your work post-pandemic? How might remote interviewing be incorporated into your work, even when in-person interviews are possible? What advantages, disadvantages do you see going forward there? What advice would you give to others as you look back. And I always like to close with anything else that you would feel remiss not to share. So thank you for listening in. I hope that this has been helpful.